At 0700 hours on January 15th, 1944, Captain Atsushi Oi sat in the cramped operations room of Japan's newly formed Grand Escort Command headquarters in Tokyo. The winter morning was bitterly cold. Steam rose from the teacup on his desk, untouched for the past hour. In front of him lay a report that made no sense. The numbers didn't add up. They couldn't possibly add up. According to Japanese naval intelligence estimates from December 1941, the United States Navy had possessed approximately 55 fleet submarines and 18 obsolete S-boats in the Pacific theater, 73 submarines total. The intelligence staff had tracked American submarine construction carefully. They knew about the 73 boats under construction when the war began. Simple mathematics suggested the Americans might have, at most, 140 to 150 submarines by early 1944, accounting for construction and wartime losses. But the shipping losses told a different story, a horrifying story. In 1943 alone, American submarines had sunk more than 300 Japanese merchant ships, totaling approximately 1.5 million tons. That was double the losses from 1942. The mathematics didn't work. 50 submarines, even 100 submarines, could not account for this level of destruction. Either Japanese naval intelligence had catastrophically miscounted American submarine strength, or American submariners had developed capabilities that defied every assumption about submarine warfare. Oi looked again at the casualty reports. Oil tankers sunk off Borneo, troop transports torpedoed in the Philippine Sea, freighters destroyed approaching the home islands. The attacks were everywhere, simultaneous, relentless. The pattern suggested not dozens of submarines, but hundreds, operating from bases at Pearl Harbor, Midway, Brisbane, Fremantle, and now advancing forward bases as American forces pushed westward across the Pacific. The reality was worse than Oi imagined. By January 1944, the United States had nearly 100 excellent fleet submarines operational in the Pacific, with dozens more completing construction every month. By war's end, the Americans would complete 228 new submarines during the conflict, bringing the total force to approximately 288 submarines when counting pre-war boats. 263 of these submarines would undertake war patrols. The Japanese had counted 55 fleet submarines in December 1941. They would face nearly 300. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The intelligence failure began long before Pearl Harbor. Japanese naval doctrine, built on the decisive battle concept perfected at Tsushima in 1905, focused obsessively on the American battle fleet. Intelligence resources concentrated on tracking American battleships, carriers, and cruisers. Submarines were considered auxiliary weapons, scouts for the main fleet, not strategic threats capable of strangling an empire. This doctrinal blind spot infected every level of Japanese naval intelligence. When Japanese planners assessed American submarine capabilities in 1941, they evaluated based on their own submarine doctrine. Japanese submarines were designed and deployed as fleet auxiliaries. They scouted ahead of surface forces. They attacked enemy capital ships. They rarely targeted merchant vessels because commerce raiding was considered unglamorous, defensive warfare beneath the dignity of the Imperial Navy. If Japanese submarines operated this way, American submarines would too. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The Americans had no intention of fighting a defensive war. 6 hours after the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7, 1941, Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, issued an order that would define the Pacific submarine campaign, execute unrestricted air and submarine warfare against Japan. The order was clear, unambiguous, and revolutionary. Every Japanese merchant ship, every warship, every transport became a legitimate target without warning, without mercy, without restriction. The Japanese initially dismissed the threat. In 1942, American submarines sank 109 Japanese ships totaling 640,000 tons. It was significant but manageable. Japan's merchant fleet had totaled 7.6 million tons at the war's start. The nation required approximately 6 million tons of shipping capacity to maintain the domestic economy and military during wartime. Losing 640,000 tons was painful, but not catastrophic. Japanese shipyards were building replacements. The convoy system was being organized. Anti-submarine warfare would improve. But the Japanese didn't understand what was happening beneath the surface, literally and figuratively. American submarines were operating with fundamentally broken weapons. The Mark 14 torpedo, the primary weapon of the United States submarine force, suffered from 3 catastrophic defects. The depth control mechanism was miscalibrated, causing torpedoes to run 11 feet deeper than set. The magnetic influence exploder detonated prematurely or failed to detonate at all. The contact exploder's firing pin jammed on direct hits because the deceleration forces bent the pin before it could strike the percussion cap. American submarine commanders were firing torpedoes that hit targets without exploding. They were achieving perfect firing solutions only to watch Japanese ships sail away untouched. They were reporting these failures in patrol reports, but the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington dismissed the complaints as crew error. The torpedoes were fine. The submarine skippers must be making mistakes in attack geometry or depth-setting procedures. Lieutenant Commander Tyrell Jacobs, commanding USS Sargo, fired 8 torpedoes at Japanese merchant ships on Christmas Eve, 1941, just 17 days after Pearl Harbor. He heard the torpedoes strike the hulls through Sargo's sonar. Metallic clangs, no explosions. The ship sailed away. Jacobs filed a detailed report stating flatly that his torpedoes had hit the targets but failed to detonate. Bureau of Ordnance reviewed the report and concluded the problem was crew error. The torpedoes were fine. This pattern repeated throughout 1942. Submarine after submarine reported torpedo failures. Bureau of Ordnance blamed the submarine commanders, but one man refused to accept the official explanation. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood took command of submarines in the Southwest Pacific in May 1942, based in Fremantle, Australia. He was 52 years old, a career submarine officer who had commanded submarines since World War I. His crews called him Uncle Charlie. When his submarine commanders told him their torpedoes weren't working, Lockwood believed them. In June 1942, Lockwood did something that violated every protocol in the Navy's chain of command. Without permission from Bureau of Ordnance, without official authorization, he took a submarine off combat operations and ran his own torpedo tests. He fired torpedoes set to run at specific depths through submerged fishing nets at Frenchman Bay near Albany, Australia. Then he measured the holes the torpedoes left in the nets. The methodology was simple but conclusive. If the torpedo was set to run at 10 feet and left a hole in the net at 21 feet, the torpedo was running 11 feet too deep. The results were undeniable. The Mark 14 was running an average of 11 feet deeper than its set depth. Lockwood sent his test results to Bureau of Ordnance with a detailed report. The Bureau reviewed the data and dismissed it. The tests must have been conducted improperly. The nets must have been set at wrong depths. There was nothing wrong with the torpedo's design. Bureau of Ordnance had designed it. Bureau of Ordnance had tested it at Newport. Therefore it worked. The depth problem was eventually fixed by late 1942, after Lockwood's relentless pressure forced official acknowledgement. But that just revealed the second defect, the magnetic influence exploder. This device was supposed to detect a ship's magnetic field and detonate the warhead beneath the keel, breaking the ship's back. Revolutionary technology. But it was failing catastrophically. Lieutenant Commander John Scott, commanding USS Tunney, found himself in a perfect attack position on April 9th, 1943. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers in front of him, only 880 yards away. He could see aircraft on the carrier decks through his periscope. He fired all 10 torpedoes, aiming carefully at all 3 targets. He heard 7 explosions. For a moment, the crew thought they'd scored hits, but when Scott looked through the periscope, all 3 carriers were maintaining speed and course. None appeared damaged. The explosions had been premature. The torpedoes had detonated before reaching the hulls. By June 1943, Admiral Chester Nimitz ordered all submarines under Pacific Fleet Command to deactivate the magnetic exploder and use only the contact trigger. This solved the premature detonation problem, but revealed the third defect. The contact trigger was also broken. The firing pin was too heavy. When a torpedo hit a target at 90 degrees, perpendicular to the hull, the sudden deceleration created forces exceeding 500 Gs. That deceleration bent the firing pin before it could strike the percussion cap. The pin jammed. The warhead didn't detonate. The better the shot, the more likely it was to fail. Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit encountered this problem spectacularly on July 24, 1943. USS Tenosa attacked the 19,000-ton Japanese tanker Tonan Maru No. 3 in the Caroline Islands. Daspit put 2 torpedoes into her from his first salvo. The tanker was crippled, listing to starboard, dead in the water. No escort vessels in sight. The sea was calm. This was the perfect kill. Daspit fired another torpedo. It struck the tanker with an audible clang. No explosion. He fired another solid hit. Another metallic clang. No explosion. He kept firing. One after another. 11 torpedoes, 11 direct hits, 11 duds. Every torpedo ran true. Every torpedo struck exactly where Daspit aimed. The crew could hear each impact through the hull. Not one exploded. The tanker sat there, damaged but afloat, mocking them. Daspit had exactly 1 torpedo left. He kept that last fish. He ordered Tenosa to surface and head for Pearl Harbor. He was bringing evidence back with him. Evidence that American submarines were being sent to war with weapons that didn't work. The torpedo problem wouldn't be fully solved until September 1943, 21 months after Pearl Harbor, 21 months of sending submariners to war with defective weapons, 21 months of ships that should have been sunk sailing away untouched. But the Japanese didn't know any of this. They only saw that American submarine attacks in 1942 were relatively ineffective. They attributed this to poor American training, cautious tactics, inexperienced crews. They didn't realize the Americans were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. This misunderstanding compounded Japan's strategic errors. Japanese naval leadership seriously underestimated the eventual threat from Allied submarines. Anti-submarine warfare was accorded low priority. Few warships and aircraft were allocated to protecting merchant shipping. The focus remained on building destroyers for fleet actions, not cheap destroyer escorts for convoy protection. Japan never developed cost-effective escort vessels specifically designed for anti-submarine work. Britain and America built hundreds of destroyer escorts during the war. Japan never made that investment. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine was also deficient. Depth charges were initially set to detonate at shallow depths. Sonar and radar capabilities lagged behind Allied equivalents. Japanese destroyers had impressive night fighting capabilities, but couldn't detect submarines as reliably or prosecute contacts as effectively as American and British escorts. Japanese naval aviation also failed to develop effective anti-submarine tactics. American patrol aircraft would eventually sink dozens of Japanese submarines. Japanese aircraft rarely sank American submarines. There was a fundamental cultural problem. The Japanese Navy prioritized offense over defense. Battleships and carriers were prestigious assignments. Escort duty was not. Anti-submarine warfare was seen as defensive, unglamorous work that didn't advance careers. The best officers and newest equipment went to the strike forces. Convoy protection got what was left. This wasn't unique to Japan. Britain had the same problem in World War I and early World War II. But Britain learned, adapted, and created an effective convoy system. Japan never made that transition. Captain Oi, the staff officer who would later write extensively about Japan's anti-submarine warfare failures, put it bluntly in his post-war analysis. Japan failed in anti-submarine warfare largely because her navy disregarded the importance of the problem. The Japanese Navy had been a disciple of the British Royal Navy. They should have been more conscious of shipping protection's importance, but by the beginning of the 20th century, Japan had established its own traditions based on the victories at Tsushima and in the Sino-Japanese War. In those conflicts, decisive fleet battles had decided outcomes. Commerce protection hadn't mattered because Japan was still an agricultural state with relatively modest seaborne trade. The empire could survive without massive maritime logistics. That was no longer true by 1941. Japan's imperial expansion had created enormous resource dependencies. The home islands had almost no natural resources. Japan imported 90% of its oil. It imported all of its rubber. It imported 88% of its iron ore. It imported vast quantities of food. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron ore from China and Manchuria, food from Korea and Taiwan, all had to be shipped by sea. The merchant marine was Japan's economic lifeline, but the naval leadership remained fixated on fleet battles, not convoy protection. Meanwhile, in Washington and Pearl Harbor, American strategic planners were making very different calculations. They understood that Japan was an island empire dependent on seaborne trade. Cut those sea lanes, strangle the shipping, and Japan's war economy would collapse. It didn't matter how many battleships the Japanese had if they couldn't fuel them. It didn't matter how many aircraft factories operated if they couldn't import aluminum. It didn't matter how many divisions the army fielded if they couldn't feed them. The Americans had the perfect weapon for this strategy: long-range fleet submarines designed specifically for Pacific operations. These weren't the small, short-range boats that operated in European waters. American submarines displaced 1,400 to 2,000 tons submerged. They had cruising ranges exceeding 10,000 nautical miles. They carried enough fuel and provisions for 75-day patrols. They were equipped with air conditioning for tropical operations, freshwater distillation units, and bunks for every crew member. German U-boats lacked these amenities. American submariners lived relatively comfortably during months-long patrols. The submarines' semis carried 24 torpedoes, far more than most other nations' boats. They had 6 torpedo tubes forward and 4 aft. The Mark 14 torpedo, once its defects were fixed, was an excellent weapon, with a range exceeding 8,000 yards and a warhead containing 643 pounds of high explosive. The submarines also mounted deck guns, initially 3-inch 50-caliber weapons, later upgraded to 4-inch or 5-inch guns for surface actions. Most importantly, the submarine force had excellent leadership. Admiral Charles Lockwood became Commander Submarines Pacific Fleet in February 1943. He brought with him the same determination that had driven him to conduct unauthorized torpedo tests in Australia. He was willing to bypass bureaucracy, fight Bureau of Ordnance, and protect his submarine commanders from official repercussions when they modified their weapons without permission. Lockwood understood that winning the war mattered more than following regulations. Lockwood also understood people. He identified aggressive commanders and promoted them. He gave them the best boats and the best assignments, men like Dudley Morton, Richard O'Kane, Samuel Dealey, Eugene Fluckey. These were the commanders who would make American submarines legendary. They were the ones who would prove that American submarines, once equipped with working weapons, could dominate the Pacific. Dudley Morton took command of USS Wahoo on December 31st, 1942. Before his first patrol as commanding officer, Morton made a speech to the crew. He declared Wahoo expendable. Any crew member who wanted to remain in Brisbane had 30 minutes to request a transfer. There would be no negative marks against anyone who stayed behind. Not a single crew member accepted the offer. They all wanted to sail with Morton. Morton's third patrol in January 1943 became legendary. He took Wahoo into Wewak Harbour on the north coast of New Guinea. There were no charts of the harbour. One of the crew had bought a cheap atlas in Australia that showed Wewak as a small indentation on the coast. Using that atlas as a guide, Morton navigated Wahoo into enemy waters. He found a Japanese destroyer nested with several submarines. Morton fired 3 torpedoes from 1,200 yards. All 3 missed or malfunctioned. This was still the era of broken torpedoes. The destroyer detected Wahoo and turned to attack. Morton could see it coming through the periscope, charging straight at him at high speed. Any normal submarine commander would have gone deep and run. Morton waited. He let the destroyer close the range. When collision seemed inevitable, Morton fired another torpedo straight down the destroyer's throat. The torpedo hit the destroyer amidships and broke it in half. The destroyer sank in minutes. 2 days later, Wahoo encountered a 5-ship convoy north of New Guinea. Morton attacked in daylight on the surface, running a battle that lasted 14 hours. He sank the transport Buyo Maru, carrying over 1,000 Japanese troops. He sank the freighter Fukue Maru. He damaged other ships in the convoy. Then he surfaced and destroyed lifeboats with deck gunfire to prevent survivors from reporting Wahoo's position. It was brutal, aggressive warfare. Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor on February 7th, 1943. Morton had expended all 24 torpedoes in a 23-day patrol. Normal patrol length was 60 to 75 days. He'd accomplished more in 3 weeks than most submarines did in 2 months. Morton's example changed the submarine force's culture. Other commanders saw that aggressive tactics worked. Lockwood started promoting aggressive skippers and relieving cautious ones. The silent service stopped being silent. American submarines went on the offensive, and by late 1943, they finally had weapons that worked. The transformation was immediate and devastating. In 1942, with broken torpedoes and cautious tactics, submarines sank 109 Japanese ships totaling 640,000 tons. In 1943, submarines sank more than 335 ships totaling approximately 1.5 million tons, more than double the previous year's total. But torpedo problems still plagued the force through most of 1943. The magnetic exploder wasn't deactivated until June. The contact exploder wasn't fixed until September. Many submarines were still using torpedoes with faulty firing pins well into the year. In 1944, everything came together. Torpedoes worked reliably. Commanders were aggressive. Tactics were refined. Intelligence from code breakers provided targeting information. Submarines operated in wolf packs. They penetrated the Sea of Japan. They hunted close to the Japanese home islands. They were everywhere. In approximately 520 war patrols during 1944, American submarines sank 603 Japanese merchant ships, totaling about 2.7 million tons, more than the first 25 months of war combined. Japanese commodity imports plunged from 16.4 million tons to 10 million tons. The net loss of shipping was about 2 million tons. Japan's war economy was starving. For the first time, American submarines struck hard at the Imperial Navy itself. They sank 7 Japanese aircraft carriers in 1944, including the fleet carriers Shokaku and Taiho at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and later Unryu and the massive Shinano, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. They sank the battleship Kongo, the only Japanese battleship lost to a submarine. They sank 2 heavy cruisers and 7 light cruisers. The Imperial Navy was hemorrhaging capital ships, but the real devastation was happening to Japan's merchant marine. Oil tankers became priority targets. By mid-1944, tankers were being sunk faster than Japan could replace them. Refineries shut down for lack of crude oil. Without fuel, aircraft sat grounded. Training flights stopped. Combat sorties decreased. Warships remained in port because there was no bunker fuel. The super battleship Yamato spent most of 1944 tied to a pier because there wasn't enough fuel oil to operate it. When Yamato finally sortied on its suicide mission to Okinawa in April 1945, it carried only enough fuel for a one-way trip. Industrial production collapsed. Factories needed raw materials that arrived by ship: iron ore, coal, bauxite, copper. All the essential materials for war production were supposed to come from conquered territories and be shipped to Japan. But the ships weren't arriving. They were on the bottom of the Pacific. Production of aircraft dropped. Production of ships dropped. Production of ammunition dropped. Japan's industrial capabilities were being destroyed not by bombing, but by submarines. On many isolated islands across the Pacific, supplies failed to reach Japanese garrisons. Troops were left to eat what they could, cultivate or forage. More important islands were deprived of munitions. Worst of all was the loss of troop reinforcements. American submarines were killing Japanese soldiers by the thousands before they ever reached the battlefield. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The numbers tell the story. In 1944 alone, American submarines killed approximately 79,000 Japanese soldiers aboard troop transports. Entire divisions disappeared beneath the Pacific waves. At critical stages of the Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Leyte campaigns, thousands of Japanese troops were killed or diverted before they arrived where they were needed. This forced Japan to release 12 divisions from the premier Kwantung Army in Manchuria to confront American advances across the Pacific. These troops, who should have been facing the Soviets, were instead drowning in submarine attacks. The Japanese cabinet would testify after the war that the loss of shipping was the greatest single cause of Japan's defeat, not the atomic bombs, not the island invasions, not the strategic bombing campaign, the destruction of the merchant marine. American submarines accomplished that destruction while representing less than 2% of the United States Navy. Back in Tokyo, Captain Oi stared at the reports piling on his desk. The Grand Escort Command had been established in November 1943, far too late to make a difference. The organization was supposed to coordinate convoy protection, but it had inadequate resources. The destroyers assigned to escort duty were designed for fleet actions, not anti-submarine work. There weren't enough of them. They lacked modern sonar and radar. The crews weren't properly trained in anti-submarine tactics. Oi knew the truth. The Japanese naval leadership refused to acknowledge. The submarine war was already lost. It had been lost when the Navy prioritized fleet construction over convoy protection. It had been lost when anti-submarine warfare was treated as unglamorous defensive work. It had been lost when intelligence officers counted 55 American submarines and assumed that number would remain relatively stable. The Americans hadn't just built more submarines. They'd built an entire system. Construction programs that delivered new boats every few weeks, training programs that produced aggressive, skilled commanders, logistics networks that kept submarines supplied and operational, code-breaking operations that provided targeting intelligence, rescue services that recovered downed pilots, torpedo workshops that finally fixed the weapon defects. Everything worked together, integrated, relentless, unstoppable. By January 1944, the Central and Southwest Pacific submarine commands numbered almost 100 excellent fleet submarines, well-seasoned, aggressive commanders, and crews comprising mostly patrol veterans exploited superior radar and sound sensors and effective torpedoes. Women code breakers at stations across the Pacific showered patrolling submarines with intelligence that set up fatal rendezvous with targets. The submarines were operating in wolf packs, coordinating attacks, overwhelming defenses. The Japanese still didn't know the full scale of what they faced. Intelligence estimates suggested perhaps 150 American submarines might be operational. The real number was approaching 200, with more arriving every month. By war's end, 263 American submarines would conduct war patrols, the force that Japan had assessed as 55. Submarines in December 1941 had grown to nearly 300 boats strangling an empire that required 6 million tons of shipping capacity to survive. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. Japan's merchant fleet had totaled 7.6 million tons at the war's start. By August 1945, it would be reduced to less than 2 million tons, with only 320,000 tons in condition to carry cargo. American submarines would account for 56% of all Japanese merchant marine losses. 1.3 million enemy merchant vessels sunk, totaling 5.3 million tons. Additionally, submarines would sink 201 Japanese naval vessels, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, 15 cruisers, and 42 destroyers. The cost was terrible. 52 American submarines were lost during the war. 3,506 submariners died. That was a 22% fatality rate, the highest percentage loss of any branch of the American military. 1 in 5 submariners who went to war didn't come home. For comparison, the overall United States military fatality rate was about 3%. Submariners died at 7 times that rate. USS Wahoo was one of those lost. Dudley Morton's 7th Patrol began on September 9, 1943. Wahoo was ordered to transit into the Sea of Japan through La Perouse Strait. The boat was never heard from again. Japanese records later revealed Wahoo was attacked by anti-submarine aircraft on October 11th, 1943, in Lapérouse Strait. All hands were lost, 80 officers and crew. Morton was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. Wahoo received 6 battle stars and a Presidential Unit citation. USS Tang was lost on her final patrol when one of her own torpedoes ran in a circle and struck the submarine. Commander Richard O'Kane survived, spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, and received the Medal of Honor after the war. He had sunk 33 ships for 116,454 tons, the highest total of any American submarine commander. The submariners knew the risks. They volunteered for submarine duty, knowing the fatality rates. They went on patrol, knowing they might not return. They kept fighting, despite broken torpedoes, despite losses, despite the knowledge that their own weapons might kill them. And they won. They strangled Japan's economy. They cut the supply lines that kept Japan's war machine running. They produced results that shortened the war and saved hundreds of thousands of lives, both American and Japanese. Captain Oi would spend the remainder of the war watching Japan's merchant marine disintegrate. Every week brought new casualty reports. Tankers sunk off the Philippines, freighters torpedoed in the Yellow Sea, transports destroyed approaching the home islands. The attacks never stopped. They came from submarines Japan's intelligence services had never detected, from bases Japan couldn't strike, executed by crews Japan couldn't match. The Japanese had counted 55 submarines. They faced nearly 300. That miscalculation, combined with doctrinal rigidity and strategic blindness, doomed Japan's empire as surely as any battle. The submarines didn't win the Pacific War alone. But without them, the war would have lasted years longer and cost millions more lives. The Silent Service, representing less than 2% of the United States Navy, had accomplished what battleships and carriers could not. They had made an island empire starve. The magnitude of American submarine success became undeniable on the night of November 28th, 1944. Commander Joseph Enright stood in the conning tower of USS Archerfish, tracking something massive on radar. The submarine had been assigned lifeguard duty for B-29 strikes against Tokyo, but no air raids had been launched that day. Archerfish was free to hunt. At 8:40 in the evening, lookouts spotted what appeared to be a large tanker leaving Tokyo Bay, escorted by 3 destroyers. Enright maneuvered closer. This wasn't a tanker. Through the darkness, he could make out the distinctive shape of an aircraft carrier, a massive aircraft carrier, larger than anything he'd ever seen. The carrier was traveling at 20 knots, zigzagging to evade submarines. Enright ordered Archerfish to pursue on the surface. For the next 6.5 hours, the submarine chased the carrier through the darkness. The Japanese escorts detected Archerfish's radar at 10:45, but Captain Toshio Abe, commanding the carrier, made a fatal assumption. He believed Archerfish was part of an American wolf pack, a decoy, trying to lure away one of his destroyers so other submarines could attack. He ordered his ships to turn away and outrun the submarine. But there was no wolf pack, just Archerfish, and Abe's evasive maneuvers kept turning the carrier group back into Enright's path. At 3:15 in the morning, on November the 29th, the carrier inadvertently presented her broadside to Archerfish. Perfect firing position. Enright could tell this ship was enormous. He decided to fire his torpedoes set for shallow running, higher up the hull than normal. Something that large might need to be hit above the usual waterline to do fatal damage. Archerfish fired 6 torpedoes. 4 hit. The explosions tore massive holes in the carrier's hull. Enright ordered Archerfish to dive to 400 feet, near the submarine's crush depth, to escape the retaliatory depth charges. The crew could hear breaking up noises through the hull, loud explosions, the frenzied movements of men trying to save their ship. The carrier was Shinano, 72,000 tons, the largest aircraft carrier ever built. Originally laid down as the third Yamato-class battleship, she had been converted to a carrier after the Battle of Midway. She had been commissioned just 10 days earlier on November the 19th. Her conversion wasn't even complete. Watertight doors weren't finished, critical pumps were missing, the crew was inexperienced. Shinano was sailing to Kure Naval Base to complete fitting out when Archerfish found her. The 4 torpedo hits flooded 3 boiler rooms. The inexperienced crew couldn't control the flooding. Captain Abe tried to beach the carrier, but Shinano was taking on too much water. At 10:57 in the morning, 7 hours after being torpedoed, Shinano capsized and sank. Over 1,400 men were aboard. Nearly 1,000 died, including Captain Abe, who went down with his ship. Enright didn't know what he'd hit. He thought it might be a large carrier, maybe 28,000 tons. The Office of Naval Intelligence didn't believe him at first. They thought all Japanese carriers had been accounted for. Only after the war did the Americans learn the truth. Archerfish had sunk the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine. The achievement earned Enright the Navy Cross and Archerfish a Presidential Unit citation. To this day, no submarine has sunk a larger warship. The sinking of Shinano symbolized everything about the submarine war. American submarines were everywhere, hunting everything. The Japanese couldn't protect even their most secret, most powerful ships. A single submarine operating alone had destroyed a vessel that represented years of construction, millions of yen in resources, and thousands of skilled workers, all gone in 7 hours because of 4 torpedoes from a boat the Japanese intelligence services had never detected. By early 1945, Japan's situation was catastrophic. Oil imports had dropped from 1.8 million tons in 1943 to 300,000 tons in 1944. Only 4,975,000 barrels of oil reached Japan in 1944 instead of the 28.5 million barrels military leaders had expected. Refineries were idle, aircraft couldn't fly, tanks couldn't move, ships stayed in port, rice shipments from Korea and Taiwan fell by 70%, iron ore shipments from China dropped to a trickle, factories shut down, civilians went hungry. The military couldn't move troops or supplies effectively. The Imperial Japanese Army was being starved into impotence, not by combat, but by submarines, sinking the ships that fed them. American submarines were strangling Japan to death. In 1945, because of the tremendous attrition on Japanese shipping by earlier submarine operations and the destructive sweeps by American fleets and carrier air forces, enemy merchantmen, sunk by submarines, dropped to 132 ships, totaling 469,872 tons. The numbers dropped not because submarines were less effective, but because there were fewer targets left to sink. The advance of American forces had driven Japanese ships back to coastlines and shallow waters. American submarines followed them there, making skillful and daring attacks in waters that should have been too dangerous for submarine operations. In April 1945, USS Taranti entered a patrolled anchorage at Quelpart Island and destroyed a 10,000-ton tanker and 2 1,500-ton escort vessels that were peacefully lying at anchor. Further south, persistent submarine patrolling plus air sweeps had stopped almost all enemy traffic along the sea lanes of the East Indies and the coast of Indochina by the end of March. By August 1945, Japan's merchant marine had less than a quarter of the tonnage it had possessed in December 1941. The American submarine campaign had accomplished what strategic bombing and surface naval operations alone could not. Submarines had cut Japan's economic lifeline completely. The cabinet of Japan would report to the National Diet after the war that the greatest cause of Japan's defeat was the loss of shipping, not the atomic bombs, not the island campaigns, not the fire bombings of Japanese cities, the destruction of the merchant marine. American submarines were responsible for that destruction. The final accounting was brutal. 263 American submarines undertook war patrols during World War II. They sank 1,314 Japanese merchant ships, totaling, say, 0.3 million tons. That represented 55% of all Japanese shipping losses during the war. Submarines sank more Japanese merchant tonnage than all other forces, surface and air, Army and Navy combined. Additionally, submarines sank 201 Japanese naval vessels totaling 540,192 tons. That included 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, 15 cruisers, and 42 destroyers. 30% of all Japanese naval losses. The submarines accomplished this while representing less than 2% of the United States Navy. 16,000 Americans served on submarine patrol during the war. Of 3,506 never returned. 22% fatality rate, the highest casualty percentage of any American force in World War II. 52 submarines were lost. Each loss meant between 60 and 80 men dead. Submarines like Wahoo, Grunion, Tang, Harder, each had their own stories of courage and sacrifice. Meanwhile, the Japanese had completely miscounted. In December 1941, Japanese intelligence identified 55 American fleet submarines in the Pacific. They knew about the 73 under construction. They assumed American submarine strength would grow to perhaps 140 or 150 boats by mid-war. They planned accordingly. Their convoy protection programs, destroyer construction, anti-submarine warfare training, all based on facing 150 submarines at most. The reality was 263 American submarines conducting war patrols, plus British and Dutch submarines operating from Australian and Indian Ocean bases. Total Allied submarine force in the Pacific reached 283 boats. The Japanese had prepared to face 150. They faced nearly 300. That miscalculation, combined with doctrinal failures and strategic blindness, proved fatal. Captain Atsushi Oi, the staff officer at Grand Escort Command, wrote his analysis after the war. His words were blunt, unsparing. Japan failed in anti-submarine warfare largely because her Navy disregarded the importance of the problem. The Japanese Navy should have known better. They had studied under the British Royal Navy. They understood naval history. They knew commerce protection mattered, but the traditions established at Tsushima and in the Sino-Japanese War had created a culture that valued offensive fleet actions over defensive convoy protection. That culture killed Japan's war effort more surely than any battle. The Japanese never developed effective destroyer escorts for convoy duty. Britain built hundreds of cheap, mass-produced escorts specifically designed for anti-submarine work. America built similar vessels. Japan continued building fleet destroyers, expensive ships designed for surface combat, not convoy protection. When those destroyers were assigned to escort duty, they lacked the sonar, radar, and training to hunt submarines effectively. Japanese anti-submarine warfare remained amateurish throughout the war. Japanese naval aviation also failed to develop effective anti-submarine tactics. American patrol aircraft sank dozens of Japanese submarines. British aircraft achieved similar success. Japanese aircraft rarely sank American submarines. The doctrinal emphasis on offensive operations meant defensive missions, like anti-submarine patrol, received inadequate attention, inadequate resources, inadequate priority. By mid-1944, experienced Japanese submariners noticed American submarines operating with impunity in waters that should have been defended. The submarine commanders who survived reported that American anti-submarine capabilities had dramatically improved. They didn't understand the specific reasons, didn't know about hedgehog mortars or improved sonar or better depth charge patterns. They only knew that submarines were dying at unprecedented rates. 6 submarines lost in 12 days to a single destroyer escort group in May 1944. Entire reconnaissance lines destroyed. The psychological impact was enormous. Japanese submarine operations became increasingly cautious. Commanders who had previously operated aggressively now spent more time submerged, ran at slower speeds, avoided areas where American destroyer escorts might be operating. This caution reduced their effectiveness as reconnaissance platforms. Submarines that remained submerged couldn't cover as much area. They couldn't transmit radio reports without surfacing. The strategic reconnaissance mission that Japanese submarines were supposed to perform was compromised by fear of American anti-submarine capabilities. Admiral Charles Lockwood retired from the Navy in 1947 after 35 years of service, most of it in submarines. He wrote several books about submarine warfare, ensuring his submariners' accomplishments were recognized. He advocated for the submarine force until his death on June 6, 1967, at age 77. He was buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery alongside Admirals Chester Nimitz, Raymond Spruance, and Richmond Kelly Turner, the men who won the Pacific War. Lawrence Daspit, who brought Tinosa home with one torpedo after the Tonan Maru fiasco, continued commanding submarines. He made 4 more war patrols, sinking multiple Japanese ships. He survived the war, continued his naval career, and retired as a rear admiral in 1962. He died in 1998 at age 87. The torpedo he saved from the Tonan Maru attack was instrumental in proving the contact trigger defect. That single torpedo provided the evidence Lockwood needed to force Bureau of Ordnance to fix the problem. Richard O'Kane, executive officer under Dudley Morton on Wahoo, went on to command USS Tang. He sank 33 ships for 116,454 tons, the highest total of any American submarine commander. Tang was sunk by one of her own torpedoes that ran in a circle on her final patrol. O'Kane survived, spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, and received the Medal of Honor after the war. He died in 1994 at age 83. The lessons from the submarine war remain relevant. Technical excellence means nothing without correct strategic employment. Japanese submarines were in many ways superior to American submarines. They were larger, faster, longer ranged. They carried more torpedoes. They had working torpedoes from day one. But they attacked the wrong targets. They were used for supply missions instead of commerce raiding. They were never employed in a coordinated campaign against American merchant shipping. They accomplished almost nothing of strategic value. American submarines had broken torpedoes for 21 months, but once the torpedoes worked, American submarines had the correct strategy, aggressive commanders, and relentless focus on strangling Japan's economy. The results speak for themselves. American submarines sank 55% of Japanese shipping. Japanese submarines accomplished almost nothing comparable. The other lesson is institutional. Bureau of Ordnance refused to believe there was anything wrong with the Mark 14 torpedo. They dismissed reports from submarine commanders. They blamed crews for torpedo failures. They resisted testing. They delayed fixes. It took a commander like Lockwood, willing to bypass the Bureau, conduct unauthorized tests, and fight bureaucracy at every level to get the torpedoes fixed. If Lockwood had been less determined, if he'd accepted Bureau assurances that everything was fine, American submariners would have continued fighting with defective weapons for the entire war. The casualty rates would have been even higher. The strategic impact would have been negligible. Sometimes the greatest victories come from solving problems nobody wants to admit exist. That's what happened in the Pacific Submarine War. American submariners knew their torpedoes were broken. Lockwood believed them and fought to fix the problems. Once they had working weapons, nothing could stop them. Technology and hardware don't win wars. Strategy and determination win wars. Having working weapons helps enormously, but only if they're employed correctly. The Japanese counted 55 American submarines in December 1941. They prepared to face perhaps 150 at most. They actually faced 263 American submarines, conducting war patrols, plus Allied submarines from Britain and the Netherlands. Nearly 300 submarines strangling an empire that required 6 million tons of shipping capacity to survive. That miscalculation combined with broken American torpedoes that masked submarine effectiveness for 2 years, gave the Japanese false confidence. They saw relatively modest losses in 1942 and early 1943 and concluded American submarines weren't a serious threat. By the time they understood the truth, it was too late. The merchant marine was dying, the war economy was collapsing, the empire was starving. American submarines didn't win the Pacific War alone, but without them, the war would have lasted years longer and cost millions more lives. The silent service strangled Japan's economy, cut the supply lines that kept the war machine running, and proved that a small force properly employed with working weapons could accomplish what much larger forces could not. They represented less than 2% of the Navy, but accounted for more than half of all Japanese shipping losses. They killed nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers before those troops ever reached the battlefield. They sank 8 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, 15 cruisers, and 42 destroyers. The cost was terrible. 22% fatality rate. 1 in 5 submariners who went to war didn't come home. But they fought despite broken torpedoes, despite losses, despite knowing their own weapons might kill them. And they won. They shortened the war. They saved lives. They accomplished what military planners in 1941 would have thought impossible. A few hundred submarines strangling an empire of 70 million people spread across thousands of miles of conquered territory. Captain Oi understood this by war's end, as he watched Japan's merchant marine disintegrate. As casualty reports piled on his desk week after week, he understood that the war had been lost not in dramatic carrier battles or island invasions, but in the silent war beneath the waves. The Americans hadn't just built more submarines than Japanese intelligence had counted. They'd built an entire system, construction programs delivering new boats every few weeks, training programs producing aggressive commanders, logistics networks keeping submarines supplied, code breaking providing targeting intelligence, torpedo workshops that finally fixed the weapon defects. Everything worked together, integrated, relentless, unstoppable. Japan had counted 55 submarines and prepared accordingly. The reality was nearly 300 submarines systematically destroying everything that floated. By August 1945, Japan's merchant marine was effectively extinct. The carrying capacity had dropped from 6 million tons to less than 2 million tons, with only 320,000 tons in condition to carry cargo. The home islands were starving. Industry was dead, the military couldn't move, the empire was finished. American submarines accomplished all of this while suffering the highest casualty rate of any American force. They volunteered, knowing the risks. They went on patrol, knowing they might not return. They began fighting. They won. And in winning, they proved that numbers alone don't determine outcomes. The Japanese counted submarines and got the numbers catastrophically wrong. But even if they'd counted correctly, it wouldn't have mattered. The Americans had the right strategy, the right tactics, the right commanders, and eventually the right weapons. That combination proved unbeatable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.